I had, in fact, a rather unique relationship with him, which probably was influenced somehow by his charisma. But I don't fully understand it. But in any case, I saw quite a bit of him. I saw him in good times. I saw him in bad times. When it looked like the Soviets would invade Poland. I even phoned him at one point under the president's instructions to alert him to the imminence of a Soviet invasion, and we discussed how it would be handled politically. But we also had quite a few discussions about religion. What does it mean to believe in God? What does it mean to know the only right path to God? I once made the point to him, because I knew that this was something which challenged Catholic orthodoxy. I said to him, well, if I was born in China and if I were brought up to be a good Buddhist, I think I would have as good a standing with God as if I was brought up a Catholic born in Poland. And much to my surprise, he said, well, you're correct, actually, which is not the official doctrine. But he was charismatic. And I suppose it didn't hurt that when he was elected Pope, the Soviet KGB produced an intelligence report. This is a fact, actually. Produced an intelligence report for Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, which said that the entire papal election was engineered by me, that I mobilized the chairman of the American Council of Cardinals, or whatever it's called, Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia at the time, a Polish American, to mobilize the American cardinals, who in turn mobilized the German cardinals to elect Wojtyla as Pope. And the Pope was aware of that, because I remember once when I was saying goodbye to him, he said to me, you have to come and see me again soon. And I did say, genuinely, I said, look, this is a great privilege. I'm not going to abuse it. Come so soon. And he waved his finger at me like this and said, you elected me. You better come and see me. Which just, of course, was a gag. But I did meet him before, and that was rather unusual in terms of my own life experience. I don't wear my religious identity on my shoulder, and I think it's also a very complex issue and involves a really painful striving to understand what we're all about. And I don't think that can be reduced to some labels pertaining to this or that named religion. So I was not particularly interested in sort of religious theology or theological leaders. But I got invited by Harvard to come to a speech he was making in the mid-'70s. I had heard about him, and I heard that he had this kind of strange impact on people, charismatic, but that was all. And yet, I don't fully understand it. I drove 50 miles to an airport in Maine because I was on my summer vacations. I took the plane to Boston to hear him. And when he finished speaking, which was a normal academic lecture, I walked up to him, introduced myself. He knew who I was. He immediately asked me to go with him and have tea with him somewhere, and we'd spend some time talking together. And that was the beginning of the contact. It then almost suffered an accident, which is actually not a serious assertion, but semi-hilarious. I was presiding at a session of the NSC, sub-session without the president, in the sit room of the White House. I forget what the issue was. When the duty officer walked up very quietly and handed me a little piece of paper while I was chairing, and I looked at it and it said, for the first time in 400 years, a non-Italian, Karol Cardinal Wojtyla of Poland has been elected Pope. I was stunned. And I said to the meeting, excuse me, I have to adjourn the meeting for a minute. And I walked out, I called the president, he was in Camp David. And I said to Carter, Mr. President, I think you ought to know, a new Pope has been elected. I know of your religious interests, so I think you'll find this interesting. It's a cardinal from Poland, Karol Wojtyla. So the president immediately says to me, do you know him? Do you know him personally? Yes, I said, well, I've met him. He's really a remarkable individual, theologian, worker priest, very strong with young people, assertive, very charismatic. He's going to make a dynamic Pope. Interesting. That evening, I'm watching television, in my office in the White House, and the president's landing in a helicopter, getting out of it from Camp David, walking to the White House, and of course the press is there, and they're all yelling, Mr. President, Mr. President, these spontaneous press conferences on the run. What do you think of the new Pope? And I thought I was going to die. The president looks at them and says, an excellent choice, an excellent choice. A very close personal friend of Dr. Brzeziński. And I thought I was going to die of embarrassment. I said to myself, okay, that's the end of any relationship with him. This guy will think I'm some sort of name dropper claiming a relationship which didn't exist at all. But in fact, we did get to know each other quite well. I saw him often. We exchanged a lot of private letters. And there's no doubt that his election gave a tremendous burst of hope to Central Europeans. Of course, preeminently the Poles, and they were the most numerous Central Europeans. And that gave them a sense of confidence, which probably many of them were still lacking entirely, given the unpleasant aspects of their Soviet experience. I didn't communicate with them other than letters or meetings, except one instance when in December of 1980, it looked like the Soviet invasion of Poland, with the solidarity strikes in Poland underway and perhaps the toppling of the communist regime imminent, might actually occur. And I did phone him up with the president's instructions to tell him that, and to say, if it happens, we'll alert you immediately, but if you think it's appropriate in the meantime to be in contact with some European clergy, because other European states may have something to say on the subject that would be constructive in averting this, it would be helpful. And I remember I phoned up, my office phoned him, and the Vatican operator at first couldn't understand how anyone can be phoning the Pope. But we told him this was the White House, it's very urgent. So finally his assistant came on the line. And then I told him I have to speak to the Pope, and he put him on the line. And to the end of this conversation, and near the end of this conversation, I said to him, I may have to call you back, unfortunately, this weekend. Do you have a private phone number? And I remember this whisper at the other end. Do I have a private phone number? He was asking his assistant. It turned out he didn't. But we made arrangements so I could call him. Obviously it was very hostile, and particularly during the more acute phases. And, the notion that I am a Russophobe by birth was obviously an easy and convenient way of characterizing me. On the other hand, I've never hidden the fact that I like Russians as people. I find them warm, engaging, very human, in a deeper sense in some respects than, let's say, we are here in America. Our relationships with others tend to be superficial. Everybody is your friend, because nobody is really your friend. You're with everyone on the first-name basis almost instantly. There is a deepening of relationships among Russians that is lacking in our society. And of course, the country has magnificent literature and a sense of its own identity, and has a great deal to be proud about. And I've never hidden that. And I've always made it very clear, to the extent I could, that my quarrel was with communism, with Leninism, Stalinism, and that the first victims of it were the Soviet people themselves. And I had a unique opportunity to convey that, which came up suddenly and accidentally. When the Soviet Union was beginning to undergo a crisis and Gorbachev was in power, I was invited to speak at the Diplomatic Academy in Moscow. No foreigner had spoken there before, and I did. My subject was the European home, and how, if there is to be a European home, and Gorbachev talked a lot about a European home, then there cannot be rooms in it that have their doors walled up. That was a kind of sub-theme. And I remember the charged atmosphere in that room, because a foreigner had never spoken there before. I stood under a big statue of Lenin speaking, and I have photographs of that. And there was a kind of excitement. And after that was over, I conveyed to Gorbachev and to Yakovlev, his principal associate, my desire to visit Katyn, where in World War II, thousands and thousands of Polish officers were shot one by one, prisoners of war, immune under international law, were executed, and the Soviets managed to blame this publicly on the Germans when eventually they recovered their territory and became known that there were thousands of corpses there. So they had to create a story putting the blame on the Nazis. The trip was arranged for me. I took the American ambassador with me to symbolize the fact that this wasn't just my Polish antecedents. And we went there. And the Soviet, regional governor greeted us with enormous pomp and circumstance, limousines, everything else. And we got in the cars, and he gave me a wreath to lay. And I looked at this wreath when we were driving there, and had ribbons on it and a sign attached to Polish officers, victim of Hitlerite killers, 1941. Victims of Hitlerite killers, 1941. Just enraged me. I ripped it off. I just asked the ambassador to give me a big sheet of paper, and I wrote on it, to Polish officers, victims of Stalin and the NKVD, 1940, and then I signed my name underneath, attached to it. We went there through this forest, horrible atmosphere and so forth. There's a monument there. Russian television was there, sent from Moscow. So they knew that I was going to be there. They gave me permission. And I put this wreath down with that sign. I kind of bowed in front of it. I could tell the secretary was leaning over and looking at it and very agitated and very upset. And the Moscow television comes up to me and says, "What are your comments?" Remember, this was still a time when the official truth was that Katyn was perpetrated by the Nazis. And I say to this television, thousands of Polish officers lay here, murdered by Stalin and the NKVD in 1940. Acknowledgement of this fact is the necessary point of departure for historical reconciliation between the Poles and the Russians, because throughout Russia there are similar graveyards in which thousands and thousands of Russians also lie, killed by Stalin and the NKVD. The secretary became more relaxed and was kind of even bowed somewhat in front of that monument and the wreath with that sign. That was the end of it, I thought. That evening I'm back in Moscow, and the ambassador comes running into my room in the ambassadorial residence and says, "You have to see this, you have to see this." An unannounced program on Katyn. And it's a program which says there are these people lying here and they're dead. Then there is a list, NKVD list of those shot. And the running of that list stops for maybe 5 seconds on a young officer with the last name Brzeziński, no relative of mine, but they show it. And then they show me there making that comment. And that evening I was at the House of Literature in the center of Moscow. And one after another, Soviet literati who were there that evening, was nothing special announced, came up and shook my hands and said, "Thank you for saying that." So when you ask me about my image, it's mixed.